Russia has not just defeated sanctions. It has not just defeated sanctions. In a sense, it has defeated the entire war effort. Not only on the battlefield has Russia been successful against the entire NATO machinery, where now you have desperate story after desperate story coming out about the lack of support from the West and Ukraine's troubling political situation, the fact that the counteroffensive has stalled and is on pause, and whatever the story may be, the battlefield situation is taking care of itself. Russia is in charge there. But again, as I've said on this program many times, this was not just a war on the battlefield. The battlefield military conflict is just a means to an end. The war is always multifaceted. There's always a political dimension. There's almost always an economic dimension. Now more than ever, with the proliferation of unilateral sanctions used by the collective West. And no other country outside of Russia has experienced the kind of onslaught around sanctions that Russia has. Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world, and it really isn't close. This doesn't mean that Iran or the DPRK or Cuba have not felt devastation from sanctions. Syria, in particular, has felt just absolutely immense pain from the sanctions leveled by the United States and its complicit allies. But Russia, by numerical sense, is by far the most sanctioned country. But even so, we've been talking for many, many months now about how Russia has basically circumvented those sanctions. The ruble was increasing in value for many months, but that was only part of the story in 2023 in particular. Now, what we are seeing is a rebound for Russia out of not the sanctions regime, not out of the oppressive environment of the sanctions regime. No, not just that. But of course, Russia was operating within a global economy that was suffering from many different ailments. And Russia seemingly has also come out of those. So, in a sense, we could say that Russia has become stronger because of the conflict in Ukraine. And many observers, many analysts, even those who take the position backed up by fact that Russia has not only been able to circumvent sanctions and also go on to the offensive in terms of its objectives. But now we are seeing that this entire sanctions regime, the entirety of the global economic meltdown, has not affected Russia in the ways we thought it would. Because it's hard to imagine a country coming out of thousands of sanctions and ending up rebounding like Russia has. Well, Russia's now showing, according to Bloomberg, that it's not just rebounding, but it's actually winning. It's not just a matter of rebounding, it's a matter of defeating the very basis for all of this. And in no other way is this more clear than how Russia has defeated the sanctions on its oil sector. So even Bloomberg has admitted that Russian figures suggest, and of course they say this as if to say that it's not that legitimate, but here they are actually legitimizing the Russian figures. They're suggesting that Russian sanctions, oil sanctions on Russia are not working. Russian budget data shows revenues from oil are surging. Moscow has amassed a huge shadow fleet to deliver its cargoes. That's what they call it, a shadow fleet, meaning this is a fleet that is not bound by Western insurance companies and all the various supply chains that the United States and Europe are trying to squeeze Russia out of. So here they say the West sanctions on Russian oil exports are failing to deprive the Kremlin of revenue to fund its war on Ukraine. In Ukraine, meaning the measures are not succeeding in one of their principal objectives, whether in dollars or rubles, net or gross. Russian finance ministry data show that the money flooding into government coffers has been grinding higher for months. The figures beg the question as to whether the group of 7 nations, especially the US and Europe, will need to take more aggressive action if they really want to deprive Moscow of petrodollars. Their key tool for curbing that funding was a price cap, that prevented Western firms from helping in the transport of Russian oil if it costs more than $60 a barrel. But one study this week showed that almost every seaborne cargo breached that threshold last month. Gross revenues from three main tax sources of petrodollars nearly doubled between April and October, coming to more than $13 billion last month. Bloomberg calculations based on the finance ministry's data show. So this is Bloomberg independently verifying, and they're independently verifying that the gross revenues from main tax sources in Russia of petrodollars doubled from April to October. The October earnings exceeded those of any single month in 2021 before the invasion of Ukraine caused unprecedented volatility in the nation's exports. So here you see the oil revenue rebound. So you have these look at this. Look at the rebound in terms of the revenue from the summertime to October. It's only gotten better. We're talking about massive rebounds. Even after deducting sizable subsidy payments to the country's oil refining industry, which jumped $2 billion to $3 billion in August to September, a surge is clear. In October, the Russian refiners didn't receive any subsidies for domestic fuel supplies, which contributed to a substantial jump in Russia's net oil earnings for the month. A spokesperson for the U.S. Treasury Department said that while the first phase of the price cap focused on reducing the amount of revenue Russia gains from its oil sales, the second phase of the measure will focus on increasing the costs Russia has to pay to keep its tankers running. To do that, the department has begun sanctioning shipping companies and vessels it says transported oil sold above the cap and started to look for ways to increase the cost for Russia using its shadow fleet. So again, desperation. They can't enforce this cap. It's not working. And Russia revenues are through the roof. They're through the roof. Bloomberg is reporting this. And so, again, this is all about not just the failure of sanctions, but also it's about the fact that Russia is essentially moving beyond what was happening before the conflict, even before the sanctions occurred. So in December last year, the European Union all but halted seaborne purchases of Russian oil and simultaneously joined others in the G7 in imposing a price cap on Russia's exports. While the initial blow led to a $25 billion deficit in Russian budget at the start of the year, the effects have faded dramatically. To counteract restrictions, Russia pivoted away from Western shipping and services. It's done so by using a vast shadow fleet of tankers that have unclear ownership and insurance status. Privately, European Union officials acknowledge that the price cap isn't working well. U.S. Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen back in September admitted the approach was losing sting. So this reminds me of after Gina Raimondo went to Beijing, had this meeting, and then China decided to drop the Huawei Mate Pro 60 with all of this advanced chip technology that supposedly the United States had sanctioned China away from. Suddenly it released this phone, and Gina Raimondo comes back to the United States and says, oh man, I'm troubled that China was able to do this. Well, the same thing happened with with the sanctions on Russia. The United States is indeed troubled at the fact that Russia's economy did not collapse because of the attempt to suffocate and stifle and strangle it from the energy economy. So for the Russian government, what matters is revenue and expenditure in ruble terms. That dictates how easily the country can fund its budgetary expenses, including the massive military spending because of the Ukraine war and swelling social obligations before presidential elections in March. And there, the news is no better for the West. The three main levies are an output oil tax, an export duty on crude and fuels, and a profit-based tax that partly replaced the production tax for some fields. Revenue from those rose to 1.2 trillion rubles in October, the highest since April 2022. It exceeded any single month in 2021. Again, the revenues that are being made on these taxes are rising to any point in 2021. So Russia is doing better than the years before the conflict, in the year before the conflict even started. The increase in Russia's revenues comes as the price of the nation's barrel has been growing both in absolute terms and relative to the international Brent benchmark. A sharp depreciation of the ruble in the recent months also helped boost revenues from oil sales denominated in foreign currencies. The G7's price cap prohibited Western firms from providing shipping, insurance, and other services for Russian oil sold above $60 a barrel. In early 2022, the discount of the nation's crude to Brent widened to a historic high of more than $34 per barrel, according to Russia's finance ministry. So here we go. We're coming to the end here. It says diminishing discount as customers, particularly in China and India, became accustomed to using the shadow fleet. The discounts between Russia's flagship grade Urals international prices narrowed. It is now closer to $10 a barrel, with Russia expecting the gap to narrow further to $5. As part of its pivot toward trying to boost Russia's costs, the U.S. Treasury recently sanctioned 5 tankers for breaching the price cap. It has also written ship management companies asking them for information regarding about 100 tankers that moved Russian oil. It's not clear if the measure will do anything to dim the shadow fleet trade in oil. The European Union is also trying to make it harder for tankers that are beneficially owned by Europeans to be sold into the shadow fleet. That could ensnare parts of the Greek fleet, even if large numbers of vessels have switched over. According to a detailed analysis of exports, almost all seaborne cargoes were brought above the cap in October, the Institute said. So, again, they're saying that about 30% of oil shipments from Russia had some involvement from a G7 entity in October. So, again, we're talking about deep involvement from the G7, deep involvement. We're not talking about, oh, this is just, Russia being able to do it all on its own. No, they're showing, the Bloomberg is showing that the G7 countries also need Russia's oil trade to continue, which always was a part of the big issue with sanctions on Russia in the first place. And so what they are saying is that in October, basically all of the exports of oil from Russia's seaborne cargoes were bought above the cap in October. There are still pressures on Russia too, so they're going to talk about how they have to, the Russian government has tried to have its subsidy payments for refineries, but face pushback from the industry as they want to cut budget expenditure. Full-size payouts have been reinstated for October, and the refiners will receive them from November, which will continue to put pressure on Russia's net oil revenues, affecting the Kremlin's flexibility. The U.S. So that, of course, they had to throw that in. Well, it's not all that great, right? Of course, nothing is perfect, right? The U.S. and its allies also argue that their sanctions have had a broader impact on Russia. The Kremlin spent billions of dollars on its fleet insurance and overall alternative ecosystem to sell oil without G7 involvement, according to a U.S. Treasury statement last month. The costs associated with this avoidance keep stacking up. So far, the G7 has no plans to change the cap, with the European Union considering stricter monitoring of the existing threshold as the alliance is working on a 12th sanctions package on Russia. I love this. Don't you love this? The Kremlin spent billions of dollars on its fleet insurance and the overall alternative ecosystem to sell oil without G7 involvement. And that is where the costs are stacking up, when everything that was said in this article, in this investigation beforehand, proved that the costs are very much worth it, that revenues are way up, that Russia's economy, especially in the oil sector, in many respects and regards, is better than in 2021, well before the conflict in Ukraine began. So all this is to say is that Russia has done quite well for itself, and that these sanctions, the defeat of them, is not just Russia surviving. It's not just about the ruble stability. It's not just about Russia remaining stable. It's also about the fact that Russia is now moving into full recovery territory in its most sanctioned economic sector, and most important, which is the oil industry. So we also have to look at how how has this shadow fleet, how has this independence been capitalized upon? Well, it's been capitalized upon through partnerships and relationships with the multipolar world. Russia's ramping up, as you see here in reports, trade with Africa and Asia, says customs data. Data released this week showed exports to Asia jumped 226 billion in the first 9 months of 2023, up 10% in the same period in 2022. In Africa, exports surged by over 50% to 15.6 billion from January to September, compared with 10.1 billion a year ago. Russia imports to the two regions also increased, amounting to $140 billion in value. In the case of Asia, up by 40% from 2022. It's also boosted purchases from Africa, up 10% to 2.5 billion. Asian countries' share of Russia's overall foreign trade now account for about 70%. Asia accounts for 70% of all trade with Russia. In contrast, Russian trade with the EU has steadily declined. Exports to the bloc plunged to just from 216.7 billion in January to September 2022 to just 65.3 billion in the same period of this year. Imports from the EU were down around 10% to 59.2 billion, data show. There's been a radical change in cargo turnover, the share and weight of countries in our trade. If previously EU countries accounted for 50% or more pre-crisis, pre-COVID times, now it is up to 16%, said the actor of the FSCS, Ruslan Dyadov, said. He added that trade with China and India was growing rapidly, while turnover with Latin America was also on the rise. So in effect, what has happened? The United States and Europe have basically cut themselves off from Russia, while Russia has built stronger and more robust relations with Asia and Africa, in particular China, in particular India, but of course, the entire global south. And of course, they threw Latin America in there for good measure. So all in all, what we're looking at is a complete shift in the world order made by the United States and Europe, made by the United States and the EU. They screwed themselves. They destroyed themselves. They laid the path for an acceleration in a trend that was already occurring. Because we have to be honest here that the sanctions campaign, the NATO encirclement of Russia, all of that was a long-term trend. Sanctions didn't begin with the Ukraine conflict, even if thousands literally were put onto Russia and slapped onto Russia following the February 2022 intervention. It was already happening. It had been happening for about a decade prior, at least, we could say. So this was a growing trend, and Russia was moving in this direction anyway. But now it is done, essentially. I mean, not done. There's still much more to happen. There's still much more integration to occur. There's so much more progress to be made. But in terms of the trend, in terms of the roots, those roots have been planted and they're never going to be taken up. They're never going to be pulled out. There are some who believe, even in Russia, I read articles in RT saying, oh, Russia will go back to the United States and Europe, I'm sure, soon. No. How could it? It's going to turn over back its trade? I don't think so. Because the United States can't be trusted. NATO can't be trusted. And they're not happy. NATO itself, especially when it comes to the China relationship, because we know how important that is to the United States and to NATO, how much of a threat that is. Still to this day, they cannot stop. Even to this day, as they are starting to become mired in the Israel situation, the Israel onslaught in Gaza, they cannot help themselves when it comes to their absolute fear of the Russia-China partnership. And here, just in November, they were blaming China's support for Russia to hindering Ukraine's counteroffensive. This is the conclusion NATO is making. This is from the Atlantic Council. And, and you won't believe the excuses they make. They claim, all right, they claim that China is supporting Russia's military by providing these things. You see this picture? Do you see this? They don't have a caption under this picture, but essentially because China is providing construction equipment to Russia, trading construction equipment, exporting it, that amounts to aiding the military campaign against Ukraine. But here's what they say. They said Russian President Vladimir Putin last month visited Beijing in October with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping as Ukraine's counteroffensive against Russia stalled. Commentators frequently pointed the finger at Ukraine's military as Western supporters for insufficient armaments to Ukraine. But it's important to acknowledge another vital factor between Ukraine's struggle to regain its land, the People's Republic of China economic lifeline to Russia. Open source trade data suggests that a surge in imports of Chinese manufactured goods with important military uses played a key role in Russia's ability to shore up its defenses on Ukrainian territory and to keep them equipped and supplied to resist the counteroffensive. Russia successfully transitioned to a defensive posture after the culmination of its offensive, dug in on Ukrainian territory, and has managed to sustain its forces there, despite continuing heavy losses of equipment and tremendous expenditures on munitions. Even as weapons and ammunition pour into Ukraine from NATO countries, they are being counterbalanced by Chinese imports, not of weapons, but material vital for Russia's ability to sustain stubborn efforts to hold on to Ukrainian territory. Can you believe what they are saying? This is how pathetic, how absolutely pathetic NATO looks on the world stage. Blaming China for NATO's insufficiency in failures because China is trading in goods, materials vital for Russia's ability to sustain a war effort. You could literally say that every aspect of an economy is vital to sustain anything in an economy, let alone a war effort. Wars cost money. Wars generally affect all parts of a supply chain across the board. Anyone who studied what happened during World War II, anyone who studied what happens to the United States during the Vietnam War, anyone that studied the US economy since its quagmires in Afghanistan and Iraq, every economist worth their salt will say, those wars actually had a pretty huge and profound impact on the economy as a whole. Why? Well, wars cost money, wars need people, wars basically affect every part of an economy. And here they're trying to blame China for simply doing trade with Russia as the reason why they could not defeat Russia on the battlefield, let alone in the economic war. Though the PRC, as far as possible to tell, has not crossed the red line in providing significant amounts of lethal aid directly to Russia, which the United States has provided copious amounts to Ukraine, mind you. Openly available trade data makes it clear that the PRC is providing massive volumes of manufactured goods and technology vital to Russia's war effort. The vast majority of what has been concluded, including this vital sustainment for Russia's military machine, is being provided openly and is not prohibited or restricted by international sanctions regime against Russia. It is legitimate trade, and although Beijing is doing nothing to discourage the trade, it is not even certainly orchestrated. To what extent Beijing is ensuring this flow to Russia, as opposed to simply allowing it, is unclear. What is clear is that what is being provided is vast in scope and very relevant toward Russia's war effort. Do you see the circles? Well, China is doing trade with Russia, and even though we don't even know if it's at all connected to how Russia is able to sustain itself, we do know it's not crossing a red line, but we do know that, well, it's trading with Russia, and that means Russia is able to better sustain itself on the battlefield. I mean, this is just a way for NATO to include China into its smoldering cauldron of new forever wars. So Chinese made digging, and and we're not I'm not even going to read the whole thing, but this is where it gets really juicy. Chinese made digging and dirt moving equipment has literally helped Russia entrench its forces in the Ukrainian territory it occupies. A massive increase in vehicle imports, including super heavy trucks, has likely enabled Russia's war industry to continue producing military vehicles that are key to maintaining combat power for defense in depth. Now, mind you, you have to look at the language here. Likely enabled Russia's war industry to continue producing. Likely. They don't know. These Chinese vehicles also enable Russia's military logistics to keep equipment and supplies moving to the front. A huge surge in ball bearing imports from the PRC, meanwhile, has also enabled the production of tanks. Finally, the continued flow of silicone chips from the PRC has provided key components for Russia to restore its weapons production, enabling Russian artillery, missiles, and drones, for example, to continue raining destruction on Ukrainian counterattack forces and civilian targets alike. Sure. Taken together, all these materials have allowed Russia to put up an effective, resilient, and multi-layered defense against Ukraine's counteroffensive. Take these away, and it's questionable at best whether Russia could have sustained its defense in depth of occupied Ukrainian territory. So again, China did it. It's China's fault. But this points to the defeat of the entirety. Again, the gambit. It all is connected. They're saying that because China has not followed sanctions on Russia, Russia has been better able to fight on the battlefield. They're making the connections, so we have to as well. So they're talking about the Surovikin line, the line of which is the defensive posture around the city of Kharkov. And it says Chinese excavator exports to Russia more than tripled in September 22 when compared to prior year levels and coincided with the construction of the Surovikin line. So they're doing a lot of association building to show that all these excavators and this construction equipment was actually having a direct impact when really all they're doing is making associations with events that were happening in September 2022 with the trade that China was doing with Russia in 2022. The biggest thing, though, and the biggest takeaway here is that rather than blame themselves, rather than talk about how the uh, effort by NATO to arm Ukraine against Russia was always going to be a failure, rather than accept the fact that Russia has circumvented the sanctions, rather than accept these facts, right? These are facts. Rather than admit and accept them and perhaps alter policy to ensure even just stability, let alone peace, but even just the stability of the overall project, they blame China. And it's because NATO has China in its sights and never wants to let it go. And it's also because NATO is also lamenting and arguably mourning the defeat of the sanctions regime. Because I think NATO, if there's anything about NATO, it's that it understands it's not really in the business of winning wars. It's really just an instrument of US foreign policy, which, let's be honest, US foreign policy is not about winning wars. It's about waging wars. It's about sowing chaos. It's about destabilization. And it's about essentially maintaining and hopefully expanding U.S. hegemony. That's not really winning the wars. The wars themselves end up becoming just a means to an overall end rather than having an end in and of themselves. That's why Afghanistan turned out the way it did. That's why Iraq turned out the way it did. That's why Libya turned out the way it did. Syria has turned out the way it did. It's because none of these wars were fought. They were fought, of course, with objectives at hand, regime change, some more successful than others in that regard. But in terms of the overall process of winning, which takes a lot more than just dropping bombs, causing terror, and raining chaos across a region or a nation. It takes actually bearing down and stabilizing the situation from whence one came. And that never happened in Libya. It certainly never happened in Iraq. And it certainly never happened in Afghanistan because the United States was by this point outstretched and outmoded in every particular way. And so when it decided it was done with the war on terror, when it decided that it was done and unable to maximize its spoils in the global south, in particular West Asia, well, it decided that it was time to drop the war on terror. It was time to drop the war of terror on West Asia, at least in terms of its focus, because again, and we have to remember that everything we're seeing in Gaza right now is a byproduct of a U.S. foreign policy regime of many decades, which took over from the colonial regimes of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, etc., which rained colonial terror and hell upon the people of that region. It never ended, so to speak, but the United States shifted its focus. It said, okay, well, we'll occupy Syria. We'll continue to have military installations all across West Asia. We'll sanction Iran, et cetera, et cetera. But now it's time to build up the path to war with Russia and China because that is the ultimate threat. And ultimately, it was the natural progression of the consequences of U.S. foreign policy itself, where you had more integration, more development, more cooperation occurring between countries in this region and all over the world with Russia and China because they were fed up with the results of U.S. foreign policy. So again, you see the cyclical nature of this, and you see how the United States, regardless of whatever offensive posture it takes, it really finds itself on the defensive in terms of attempting to achieve these objectives, the main ones being maintaining and expanding its hegemony. That is looking like it is going to be a failed venture from here on out. And so the defeat of sanctions, Russia's victory over sanctions in this regard, is critically important. It demonstrates that, well, for one, NATO is not indestructible. Actually, the entirety of the Ukraine project shows that NATO is actually destructible, that it is not impervious, that it is, in fact, rife with many weaknesses, many contradictions. That if you are strong enough, if you have the sovereignty, if you have the vision, if you have the support of the world on your side, which Russia had all of those things, then you too can also be victorious. This serves a lesson to what we are seeing now in the world as a region that is ultimately in, I think, more dire straits. We're talking from Asia proper now to just West Asia. It serves as a lesson that the strength required, the sovereignty required, the unity required, all of that is still not ripe in the West Asia region yet to sustain solidarity with the Palestinian cause, to the need of overall stability for the region, peace, and self-determination for everybody. We're not at that stage yet. But if Russia is any lesson, if the Ukraine project is any lesson, it is that it takes sustained and constant valiant resistance, ongoing resistance, to ensure that those conditions eventually happen. And which is why we are seeing an onslaught now, but as many anti-colonial struggles and movements before, as the world order changes now to a multipolar one, I think we can confidently say that the entirety of the United States empire is on borrowed time. And that includes Israel, that includes Ukraine, that includes all of these various conflicts, and all these various client states and regimes waging wars on the U.S. behalf, or maybe in conjunction with the United States, like Israel is, that they're all on borrowed time. And eventually, with persistence, with resistance, and with the overall aim in mind to build a new world, that it surely is indeed possible. Russia's defeat of the sanctions regime and its overall march to victory in Ukraine, in the Ukraine conflict, is surefire proof that it can happen, and it really is a matter of time. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.